Hello and welcome to the Rooster Call, show where liberty lives, ad hominem dies, and commies need not apply. I'm your host Jason, and today is a solo episode, and a very important one at that. I am honored to be here because it is my honors project. So, I've taken a keen interest in American history. See, I may not be a history major, but I've always held one doesn't need a degree in something to be good at it. Now, I've noticed an ideological, and I think perhaps unintentional, gap in the way that we are discussing American history. There is a tendency for people to never truly be in the center. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me introduce to you the spectrum of how I'm conceptualizing the ways that people discuss American history. On the two extremes is anti-American and America apologist. Now, what does that mean? Someone who is anti-American is somebody who you may see screaming in the streets saying that America can only do bad, that we were founded in racism, sexism, and bigotry, and that our country is irredeemable. We need to tear up the Constitution from the start and kind of just start over. On the far other extreme is America apologists, people who will make the claim that America is, just the shining city on the hill and entirely skip over and at this point even start to justify the bad things that have happened in American history. For example, slavery, the Trail of Tears, decimation of the Native Americans, Japanese internment camps. These are things that through an intellectually honest reading of American history, we can see are morally abhorrent by both today and arguably in some ways by their standards as well. And now I caution against using today's standards to judge history. A lot of people do that. And I guess that's the heart of this thing is America isn't only good and isn't only bad. It's very complex. And within this framework, there is a lot of people who are prominent historians who in some way or another get it wrong. The first person that I would like to discuss is David McCulloch, and I'd like to juxtapose him against Howard Zinn. Both of them are prolific historians in their own right. Howard Zinn is famous for his work, The People's History of the United States. It gave a slightly contrarian approach to what the history books may teach you, and said, hey, America, we've actually done some messed up things. David McCulloch, on the other hand, is a very, it comes from an English background like myself. The book that I read to this end is 1776. Another thread that I'd like to pull as an English major here, you have to remember that these men wrote for their times. David McCulloch wrote with the grain of the traditional, America is good and the founding fathers are great men and that sort of thing. When Zinn was first writing, the culture was kind of McCullochified in the sense that he was writing against the grain. And Zinn was part of a movement who wanted to bring light to other underrepresented figures such as Frederick Douglass and really just taking that approach and saying there's more to American history than meets the eye. He was proposing a new framework of how to look at American history. What's very interesting is that you would expect Howard Zinn, who's writing about these underrepresented narratives, to write a rousing story of the oppressed, people rising up against tyranny. But instead, you get him, it reads as a dry textbook, something that's kind of bland. It's really just, here is event number one, event number two, here's how they kind of all tie together in the framework. The American Revolution was nothing more than a clever ploy to keep people within a certain class. But McCulloch, he takes on the rousing perspective that you would expect out of Howard Zinn. And I think it's an interesting juxtaposition between the two of them of expectation versus reality, but also as a result of the time that they were going in. The main thing between the two is that they each lean on one side or another. I coin an entirely new term to sort of put their middle ground in the spectrum. Because I don't think it's intellectually honest to call Howard Zinn anti-American, and I don't think it's intellectually honest to call David McCulloch an America apologist. So instead, I put McCulloch as America receptive and Howard Zinn as America critical. Now, in their works, this attitude is reflected. For McCulloch's sake, he does speak sometimes about the horrors of slavery and how it was an issue. That was an unavoidable thing at the time. But I feel like he kind of glosses over it just a little bit because the focus and scope of his book was a lot more on this is how the revolution happened and that sort of thing. And at the time, slavery was just sort of the thing that happened. And so it wasn't like the Civil War that later became explicitly an abolitionist war. Instead, it was something that they really had to put on the back burner for a while. And so if he's just writing about the year 1776, of course, he's not going to cover in any substantive way slavery. But in the same token, it was a real issue that was going on at the time, and I think deserves to be talked about. On the other end, you've got Howard Zinn, and I put him as America critical, because, like I said, I don't think it's fair to say that he's like an anti-American communist. Like, that's really pigeonholing him. So here is my academically honest take on Howard Zinn. He has an interesting intention. He wants to tell the story of America through a lens that the public at the time of his writing may not have heard. There were actually plenty of things in American history that were wrong and that are morally abhorrent and ought to be called out as such. He proposes this contrarian framework that America is not as good as it's cracked up to be, but he doesn't close the circle and give a call to action to his readers. Anyone reading it now without a clear mission statement or a call to action, one is left to walk away from that book getting a, well, I guess America sucks attitude. That leans more towards the anti-American side, the radical belief that America is only bad and tainted from the start. And so I think that there is a lot of issues against trying to create this nuanced viewpoint. It is not lost on me that this very spectrum that I've created unintentionally parallels a political spectrum of right and left. Someone who may be a conservative Republican is more likely to be an American apologist and say, America, hoorah, we're, the best thing ever and we can do nothing wrong. Whereas someone who's on the far left might scream and rip their hair out saying that, we're flawed from the start. And I think one thing here is it's important for me to recognize my own bias. David McCullough, I think, is a very prolific author, and I like him quite a lot. One of the main things is not only to create a framework, a better way of discussing American history, but also bringing myself more in line with the framework that I am proposing. I think that there's a lot of roadblocks, and they mirror our political spectrum. On one hand, people are very tribal, and that has been intentionally or unintentionally abused, both for political parties and with this. Someone who believes in their core that America is just doomed from the start may not be receptive to hearing someone who says, hey, hold on now, what about all of these good things? The second you tell someone who is an American apologist that, hey, maybe slavery wasn't such a good idea, they might pull you aside and be like, you goddamn liberals trying to spit on the good image of America, get out of here. And I think that confirmation bias is another huge thing that impacts people. They kind of put on these blinders, and again, similar to our political divide, they refuse to seek out sources of information that challenge their beliefs. And that's something that I've had to do myself. I've had to read Howard Zinn. I didn't really want to read Howard Zinn, but I specifically said, no, I am going to hold myself true to the principles of this project and try to live by the very framework that I have set forth. I think another roadblock against having a more nuanced take is that there really isn't a good framework for this. And that's part of the solution that I want to create. So here's my solution. The scope of this project is meant to point out where there is a gap in American history. The way that it is discussed, the way that it is taught, and the way people think of it. Now, I am not a historian. Don't get me started on George B. Cortelyou, but for the purposes of this project in the American Revolution, I am no expert, and I recognize that. For me, the best I can do is put forward this centrist viewpoint. America isn't only good. America isn't only bad. America is very complex. History itself is very complex. And I think that having these pigeonholed extremes of, only good or only bad serves to further divide people and make them less likely to actually hear the center point. I guess an example is Thomas Jefferson was a very complex man. For all of the good that he did in writing the Declaration of Independence, he still was a slave owner. And that is something that is unavoidable. But someone who is America critical or even anti-American would be, well, see, that proves it. Thomas Jefferson's just this bad man who didn't care about human rights. Someone on, America apologist side would be like, well, no, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, I mean, that's got to stand for something. I mean, he was the third president of the United States. He did all of these good things, like, really behind the philosophy that governs us and that sort of thing. Someone in the middle might say, you know what, Thomas Jefferson, he owned slaves, but he also wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those words, when the Civil War rolled around, rang true and allowed down the line for slavery to be abolished. One could make the argument that perhaps Thomas Jefferson, despite owning slaves, understood that it was a morally abhorrent practice. Initially put in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence that he didn't like slavery. That was one of his gripes against the king. And that was edited out in revision, but it was also, he was a product of his time, and he didn't, even when he died, he didn't free his own slaves and the slaves that he had children with and his own child. That doesn't justify slavery, but it paints Thomas Jefferson in a complex way. A lot of people try to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and a lot of people put on selective blinders to see this is only good or only bad. But the thing is that he had his fair share of both. And that is the central framework that I'm proposing applied to this one key figure. Just by my own historical knowledge, I just sort of applied it right on the spot as I recorded this. It's important to look at all of the things. And I will admit that that is a difficult thing to do, because my framework demands that you really take a holistic viewpoint of both the good and the bad. There's only so much that one person can read, but I hope to start a larger movement. I don't know what I'm going to call this movement, but whether you're a history major, a history buff, or just someone who cares about our nation, I think it's important to think about things with a bit more nuance. Here's my call to action. Founders were very flawed men who wrote a standard of having a more perfect union. They were unable to live up to that standard in their time. Arguably, we are unable to live up to that standard even now. But it falls incumbent upon us, the current generation of Americans, to do better than they were able to fight harder, to grow larger, and to live that idea into existence. I believe that the way for you to do that, dear audience, is to take a look at your own understanding of history and try to see the other side of things. Try to question whether or not you're actually right. Even though I initially was skeptical of Howard Zinn, I did think he had a very good point, that America isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And an intellectually honest reading of history, like the one that I'm proposing, keeps that into account. It doesn't skip over the ugly bits like David McCulloch might have done. It doesn't only focus on the bad. It looks at both equally and gives them their due diligence. I think that it is very important that this is tackled piecewise in order to build out, okay, we have, the Gilded Age, we have World War II, we have World War I, we have, westward expansion. And how do we think about each individual time period within this framework? I cannot do that. Just go all throughout American history and all across world history. This framework can be applied to anyone and everyone who cares about history. And so that is my challenge to you. Think a bit more about what you believe and why you believe it, and come to a conclusion that takes down the blind spots. I'm Jason Brewster, and be sure to spread the calling.